Well, good morning, everyone. Today we come to the second to last study of Philippians, and it's a really important topic that we're going to discuss today. It's important, especially in light of what is going on in our culture. And I don't mean simply what's happening today on this January 31st, 2022, although it includes that. But as we look at what has been building in the West, and especially here in the U.S. for decades, this idea that you are a victim. Are you aware of how many different ways and different times we are told as a society that we are victims? Our government, the leaders of culture, so many of them want us to feel like we have been wronged by somebody else. Now, I should clarify. If you are a white man, you are not the victim, you are the oppressor. But for everybody else, you're a victim. If you are a woman, you are a victim. Evil white men have oppressed you. And you lost the birth lottery, meaning the sex lottery. You were born a woman, and you have to bear the burden, say, of carrying a child and being the mother of a child, which ties you down, weighs you down. You don't get to fulfill your dreams. You don't get to pursue a career. You don't get to do all the things that the man does. You're a victim of womanhood. So we have to eliminate all of those things that oppress you. We have to make it so that you can have free sex without threat of pregnancy. So we invented a birth control pill or abortion to relieve you of this undue burden of carrying the child. So that's if you're a woman, and there are many others. You've been suppressed. You've been, you're the wage gap of nonsense that's being perpetrated out there that women make less for the same job. I mean, come on, if that were true, every businessman, every CEO, every business owner in the world, if he could hire a woman to do the same work and pay her 70% less than he pays a man, every businessman in the world would hire women instead of men. It's crazy. It's nonsense. Now, that's just women. If you are of a certain ethnicity, then you are a victim because white man has mistreated you. If you are a certain skin color, you're a victim. If you were born in this part of a city, you're a victim. On and on the list goes. From every angle possible, the culture is trying to convince us that we are victims, that somebody is oppressing us. And the goal here is, from the government's perspective, is to make us more dependent on the government. They're our savior. They are our provider and our protector. And so if they can convince us that we are victims, then we will run to them for our security, for our provision, that kind of thing. Well, how does the government take care of the victims in their country, in their nation? Governments, you realize, cannot produce anything. They have no money. Government is not a business that it can generate income and has no products to sell. How does government get money? They take it from the citizens, right? So the government says, you're oppressed. We're going to take money from everybody, and then we're going to give it to whomever we want. And from grade school through middle school, through high school, and especially in college and university, in our media, it is reiterated again and again and again. We're victims, we're victims, we're victims. Somebody is oppressing us. We have rights that are not being met, and we need to demand those rights be met, and the government is the one to ensure those rights are being met. Now, compare that mindset, and my fear is we as Christians, especially now, we've been through this for several generations. I hear Christians talking like this. And by the way, if you think this is just the left, and it certainly is the left, the Democratic Party here in America, the political left, they're open about it. This is what they want. But the political right is not much better. If you think Republicans are different from what I'm just describing, you're largely naive. Oh, there may be a few exceptions, but by and large, conservatism, republicanism, it's not any different. Those who are in government primarily, mostly, have this view that we as the government need to take care of all the people and make sure that no one feels oppressed, that kind of thing. Now, my goal here is not really about government. That's another topic for another time. My concern is that we as Christians, because we've been immersed in this at every education level, we also come through life with this victim mentality, feeling oppressed, feeling like I deserve more, I deserve better. I mean, if you've been at a graduation ceremony, you know this is what they tell you. You can change the world. You can be anything you want to, and don't let them, whoever they are, ruin your dreams and shut you down and all that kind of stuff. You have the right to pursue your dreams and goals, and don't let anybody stand in your way. And that so easily slips into the Christian and our thinking. And we feel oppressed, and we feel victimized, and we feel like we're not getting our needs met and our rights. And it drives us to discontentment with the circumstances of life because we're convinced, we've been told we deserve better. And today we're going to see the Apostle Paul completely demolish that whole mindset. And it's humbling, and it's convicting, but it's also the path to true joy and contentment. So that's what we're going to look at today. Welcome. That was a long introduction and maybe a little heavier than you were expecting, but glad you're with us. Good morning, Keith. Good morning, Karen. Good morning, Carol. Anyone else who is with us, glad that you have joined us. We're nearing the end of our study of Philippians. We've got today and tomorrow. Excuse me, I'm still coughing. Most of my other symptoms are gone, but as I talk, I cough, and obviously I'm talking here, so please bear with me as I cough in your ear. All right, so Philippians chapter 4, we're going to pick up in verse 10 and see some amazing words from the Apostle Paul. So let's look at it here together. Paul says, but, or it could be translated now I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity. So Paul is if you remember, he's received this letter through the deliverer, Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus was sent from the Philippians to Paul with a gift. And it's been some time here that has passed since Paul received this gift, and he's just now writing back to them. And he's remembering their gift, and he's rejoicing in it. He is filled with joy that they have sent him this gift. And there's a couple words here that it's worth just clarifying. He says, now at last you've revived your concern for me. In English, that sounds like finally, at last you have shown some concern, but that's not the way the expression is in the Greek. It's you've now finally had opportunity. You've now in these last days been able to, and that could be weeks, you've been able to show concern for me. And that's really the thing. He uses this word. Revived is a okay translation, but your concern is flourished. It's a word of like a flower that has now come into bloom. Your concern for me has now had an opportunity to blossom. That's kind of what he's getting at. And he says, clearly you were concerned for me before, but you didn't have an opportunity. And we don't know exactly why they lacked opportunity. As we read other letters of Paul, we know that there were a lot of people trying to take Paul out. They did not like his ministry. We've seen that in Philippians, right? If you remember back earlier, he said there were people who were preaching the gospel, not so much because they cared that sinners come to faith and receive forgiveness, but they were preaching the gospel because they wanted Paul to suffer. Remember when we looked at that? What an awful thing that someone would preach this truth simply to make Paul suffer. But he had enemies everywhere. And many of them, as we read the other letters, were calling Paul basically a moocher. Yeah, Paul is making a fine living off of you all. You keep giving to his ministry, and he's living the high life. And so for periods of time, Paul said, I don't want people's money. He worked. We call him a tent maker. And he worked with his hands and had a job because he didn't want to be paid from the churches. And he makes a big deal of this in a couple of the letters. He says, I have every right to receive income. This is the way the Lord has set it up. Those of us who preach the gospel, those who are missionaries, those who serve the church by teaching, we have every right, Paul says, to receive support from the churches that we teach. But he says, I'm going to forego that right because I don't want anybody to say I'm doing this for money. So it may be that Paul kind of shut off the Philippians and said, I'm not going to take anything from you because I don't want my detractors to have any evidence for their false claims. We don't know for sure. But whatever it is, the Philippians, for a period of time, had no opportunity to support Paul. But now they do. And they've sent this gift, and Paul is rejoicing. Remember, he started off the letter saying, I rejoice in your participation with me in the gospel. You've been behind me. You've been supportive of me. You've been partners with me from the beginning, and it caused me joy, Paul says. And here he is again saying, I'm rejoicing that you have sent this money with Epaphroditus to me. But he's very quick to say, I don't want you to think for a moment that in this missionary letter that I'm sending you, that I'm asking for more money. Have you received those kinds of letters from missionaries where it's sort of a veiled, subtle, or maybe not so subtle request for more money and almost a manipulative kind of thing? I mean, we know the health and wealth prosperity folks that are just unashamed to demand that people send them money. They call it seed money. If you send me money, then the seed of God's blessing is there, and all these people are going to be lost, and all these things are not going to happen if you don't send me more money, and they're just unashamed to manipulate people and coerce people to send gifts and monies. But then there could also be a much more subtle way of saying, hey, thanks for your gift, and wink, wink, send me more. Now, there are many, many ministries, many folks that are dependent on the gifts of others. Cross to Ground Ministries, we're dependent on the gifts of others, and we pray that the Lord would provide. But those of us who receive gifts from others, we need to be very careful that we're not just subtly trying to manipulate. And Paul wants to make sure nobody has even a moment of thinking that's what Paul is doing. Look what he says here. Not that I speak from want, or it could be translated need. I'm not writing to you. I'm not speaking these words about rejoicing in your gift. I'm not speaking that from this perspective of want, like I'm lacking something. Now, do you remember the circumstances from which Paul is writing? If you're with us, put it in the chat if you recall. What is Paul's, what's his circumstance right now? Where's he writing from as he writes to the Philippians? And I'm going to give you a chance to make sure that you are with me before I go on. He says, I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. So it doesn't matter what I'm going through, Paul says, I've learned contentment. And I'm not writing this as a manipulative missionary letter, hoping and trying to get you to send me more money. That's not what I'm doing here. Yeah, Keith got it. He's in jail. He's in prison. Now imagine he's writing from prison and saying, I'm not speaking to you from want. I don't need anything. Now, if you remember, we talked about how this was not like our modern prison system where you are provided basic necessities. You have food and shelter that the society pays, right? We pay our taxes, and money from the taxes we pay goes to make sure that prisoners have food and have a roof over their head, and in some cases they have some comforts, right? They can work out and they can have some entertainment and that kind of thing. So we as a society provide for the basic needs of those in jail. That was not the case in Paul's day. He was completely dependent on the gifts and provisions of people who cared for him. So he's chained to a prisoner, and if he didn't get gifts from friends and concerned folks, he would starve to death. He wouldn't have anything. He wouldn't have clothes to wear, that kind of thing. So here's a man in that situation saying, I want you to know I'm not writing this rejoicing in your gifts. I'm not writing this from a place of want. What an attitude. If anybody needed anything, it would be Paul, a prisoner. He says, no, I don't need anything. I'm not writing from a position of want. What do you mean, Paul? Well, I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I'm in. Now, he's going to come back to that, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But let's go on and see what he says here. He says, I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. So I've learned I get along when I have nothing, like right now in prison, and I've learned to live contently with a whole lot. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. So he's been in the whole gamut he's experienced. He's had way more than he needs, living the high life, the good life, living very pleasantly. And he's learned here living, suffering in jail with nothing, ready to starve to death. And he says, I don't need anything. I don't need anything. Don't give because you think I'm dependent on your gifts. I'm not a victim. I'm not a victim. Now, this astounds us, should astound us, if we really remember what Paul has been through. If anybody could be tempted to self-pity, it would seem like it would be Paul. I mean, he has spent the last 30 years of his life devoted to preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. He left everything. And remember where he came from. He's a highly educated man. He had power and authority in the Jewish religion. He had studied under the most renowned rabbi of his day. He was on the Sanhedrin, as far as we know, which was the upper level of authority and influence in Judaism. He had great zeal. He had everything going from him, and he would have been a very wealthy man. And the Lord confronts him and says, give all that up and come follow me. And I'm going to send you to places where you're going to preach the gospel. And he did. And he spent 3 decades doing this. And it was not a pleasant experience. Let me take you to 2 Corinthians as Paul here describes what his life was like. So here is one of those places where he's having to defend his integrity against the lies and false accusations of those who want to bring him down. And he hates this. Paul hates talking about himself. But he's convinced here, writing to the Corinthians, that if he doesn't, then people are going to be persuaded by the lies that others are telling. So here's what he says here in 2 Corinthians. He says, are they, these false apostles, these detractors, are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane. He feels like an insane man having to defend himself here. He says, are they servants of Christ? I more so. I'm even more of a servant of Christ than they are. In far more labors than they are. In far more imprisonments than they are. I mean, think about that statement. Paul has been in prison. He's writing to the Philippians here from prison, but he's been in prison many, many, many times. Over and over and over again, he found himself in jail for the cause of Christ. To serve God, he's in prison over and over again. He's in prison, he gets out, back in prison again, gets out, back in prison again, gets out. Beaten times without number. Now, we read through these lists and we read through them so quickly. Have you ever been beaten for the cause of Christ? Has anybody ever come to you and said, you are a Christian? You say yes. And they drag you out in the streets, and with sticks, rods, rocks, fists, whatever, they beat you? None of us have experienced that. Right? Paul did over and over. He says, I've been beaten so many times I can't count how many times I've been beaten for the gospel. Kind of makes the oppression we experience here. Oh, you're one of those wacko Christians. Oh, you're a prude, right? You're a bigot. It kind of makes those insults that we experience. And we think, oh, the hardship. People look at us funny. And we clam up. We close our mouths. We stop preaching Christ. We don't really want to be known as Christians because we don't want to be mocked. And here Paul, beaten times without number, gets back up and preaches again. It's amazing. Often, he says, in danger of death. Often. Not once, not twice, often in danger of death for the sake of the gospel. He says here, 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. Now, we need to understand this. The Jews had a rule. When you whipped someone, you were not allowed to whip them with 40 lashes. And they had these whips with several strands, and sometimes there'd be bone chips on the end. And they would whip you, and they were convinced that if you were whipped 40 times, it would kill you. So their law required you to stop at 39. So Paul is basically saying here, I was beaten with these whips with bone chips on the end. I was whipped 39 lashes. I received that 5 times. 5 times in my life, he's saying, I was beaten to within an inch of my life. Can you imagine that? For the sake of Christ, 5 times being whipped so horrendously and severely that the law said if they whipped you one more time, you would die. It would kill you. 5 times he experienced that kind of whipping. He says, 3 times I was beaten with rods, big sticks, until the one who was being beaten couldn't get up. In fact, he describes one of these in Acts, and it says, they all left him thinking he was dead. They beat him with rods so much so that they all walked away, thought, we killed the man. He's dead. He's gone. Once I was stoned. Now, I'm from Colorado. I need to clarify what stoned means here. He doesn't mean he smoked pot. He was stoned, and they thought they had stoned him so that he was dead. They picked up rocks, threw it at him, pummeled him head to toe, bruised, bloody, everything swelled on his face, head, probably concussions, and he was left for dead. It says 3 times I was shipwrecked. 3 times. We know of one of them from the book of Acts. 3 times, he says, the boat capsizes and he's out in the middle of the water. He says, a night and a day I have spent in the deep. So he's shipwrecked. The ship is blown a hole in. It hits something and it can't move and it's shattered. And a day and a night in the water, floating on a piece of driftwood or something. Amazing. It says, I have been on frequent journeys in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers. Right? So he had to travel on foot everywhere he went and had to traverse streams and rivers, get caught in the current and get swept away and die. Dangers of that. Dangers from thugs hiding along the way of these paths, ready to take somebody out who's alone. Dangers from my countrymen, the Jews, constantly trying to have him executed. Dangers from the Gentiles, seems like everywhere he went, Gentiles got riled up and attacked Paul. Dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness or desert, dangers from the sea, dangers from false brethren. I've been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. This was the life of the Apostle Paul after becoming a Christian. And Paul says, I have learned to be content in each and every circumstance. I am not writing to you from a state of want. If anybody had the right to say, I'm a victim, I'm being poorly treated, if anybody had the right to say they are, Lord, why? If anybody was tempted to be self-pitying, it's Paul. Look all I've done for you, Lord. Look what I've been through. And here I am in jail again. You're a victim, are you? You've been so poorly treated, have you? You deserve better than this, do you? Really? Says who? Who's oppressing you? Who has said you have rights to a different life? We're not victims, folks. We're not victims. So, how has Paul learned to be content? That's what he says twice here. I've learned to be content. I've learned the secret of being filled and abundant and going hungry. What's the secret? Well, he doesn't say, I've learned to turn my dependence to the government and let them take care of me. Yes, I'm going to receive all these gifts from others. I'm going to allow people to provide for me because I'm a victim and I have learned what it takes to receive from others. That's not what he says. Nor does he say, I don't need anybody. Right? This is not some stoic independence. I'll take care of myself. Thank you very much. I don't need you. I don't need your government. I don't need your handouts. I don't need other Christians. I don't need other people. I can take care of myself. Which is sort of, those are the two options in our day. Either you say, yes, I am a victim, and you let the government take care of you, or no, you hold up on fists, say, I refuse to be the victim of anybody in some kind of an arrogant, self-sustaining way. Paul says, no. That's not it either. What's he say? I can do all things through him who strengthens me. He says, I am utterly and completely dependent on God. He doesn't blame God. He doesn't cry in self-pity toward God. He didn't say, God, how dare you? He didn't say, God, how could you let me experience this? No. The Lord will give me the strength to do whatever he calls me to do. Now, this Philippians 4:13, a lot of people say this is their favorite verse. It's one of those great coffee cup verses. You know, people have it on their walls. They get it tattooed on their bodies. And it's so often taken out of context. Paul's not saying that he can throw a rock to the moon. He's not saying he can lift a car. He's not saying he can solve for pi. He's not saying he can actually do everything through Christ. He is saying, I can endure. I can persevere. I can be content in each and every circumstance the Lord calls me to endure because he will give me strength. That's what Paul means. He is utterly and entirely dependent on Christ. And his only concern is to please Jesus, to serve Jesus, to do what Jesus has called him to do. And sometimes Jesus' call includes experiencing great prosperity, lots of great food, lots of great circumstances and joy and happiness, and things are going his way. And he says, I have learned to be content in that. He enjoys God's blessing in those times. He doesn't despise it. He doesn't look down on it. He's not pessimistic through it. He enjoys it. God is pouring out his favor right now, and I'm content to receive those blessings. And then God says, now is a time for hardship and suffering. And Paul, you are now going to experience pain. And now you're going to be beaten. And now I'm going to take away all those comforts. And Paul says, I have learned to be content also in that place. Because all that matters to me is doing what Jesus has called me to do. And I know he will give me whatever I need to finish the task, to fulfill the mission he's given me. So the question for us is, how much have we been sucked into this lie of victimhood and dependence on others? You're not a victim. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't true abusers and oppressors. There are. But we are not to go through our lives claiming to be victims and calling out all the oppressors and abusers. No, we're to say, what has God given to me as a mission? What has he called me to? If you're a husband, you're called to love your wife. If you're a wife, you're called to respect and submit to your husband. If you're parents, you're called to raise your children well. If you're a child, you're called to obey your parents. If you have a job, you're called to do your job well. If you're a pastor, you're called to preach and teach the word of God. On and on down the list. We know these things that God has called us to do. And he says, trust me, be content whether I pour out great favor or whether I lead you through the valley of the shadow of death. Look to me to give you strength to be faithful in the task I've called you to. God says, I will provide. And your job is to press on faithfully and be content. Do you see why it matters that in chapter 3 he says, I am pressing on to the resurrection? I know that the Lord someday is going to replace this body of mine with a new body in a new place. See, we're not there yet. Now, someday we will be in a place where there is no oppression at all. There's no suffering. There's no pain. There's no sorrow. We will be more than we can possibly imagine. Riches and wealth and favor. Streets lined with gold is the way it's described. Not just streets lined with gold, streets of gold. And the walls of the city being great jewels. Everything you could ever hope and want, it will be ours in Christ in the next age, in the resurrection. But that's not this age. And the call now is to persevere in joy and faithfulness, no matter whether God brings great abundance or poverty. And we draw strength from him. And we don't let the government or anybody else take credit for what they provided. And we don't take credit for ourselves. We say, the Lord has given me strength. We can endure all things through him who strengthens us. Well, our time has passed. Come back tomorrow, same time, 7:30 a.m. Mountain Time, and we will finish up this great book of Philippians and see what he has for us. But today, let me just challenge you. Search your heart a little bit. Ask the Lord to reveal where you have fallen prey to victimhood in our culture and say, you know what? I refuse to play the victim. I can, in the strength of Jesus Christ, do whatever he's called me to do. Grace and peace to you in the Lord. We'll see you tomorrow. God bless.